Hey, everybody. Welcome to Unwriting the Bible. Had the opportunity today to interview Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, who was one of the pivotal people in my understanding of oral tradition and how to apply that to interpretation. His book, Oral Tradition and the New Testament, A Guide for the Perplexed. And man, I knew coming into this conversation that I already liked Rafael. I stalked him a bit on the internet, watched a couple of interviews that he did on other podcasts. Of course, I've read this book a few times. I read his most recent book on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and I could just tell that Rafael was a sincere lover and follower of Jesus, that he was passionate in studying God's Word, and he was good at studying God's Word, and that he really loved his family. I just knew I'd like the guy, and really enjoyed my conversation with Rafael. Some things we didn't get to touch on a whole lot because the conversation just took different twists and turns to a lot of fun places. One very important thing that I wanted to talk about was our, what I thought was maybe a disagreement in what he calls his morphological approach in this book, and actually talk about how much I thought he was wrong in my book that I wrote. And now I'm not so sure after reading his book again for this interview and talking with him. I think that maybe I thought he was trying to say some things that he wasn't trying to say, and I was trying to say some things that he wasn't trying to say or wasn't trying to not say. But anyway, at any rate, hopefully we'll get to chat about it again, and maybe we'll even record it. So yeah, it was a great discussion. If you don't know Dr. Rodriguez, Rafael Rodriguez is professor of New Testament at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He has 3 degrees in biblical studies, a bachelor's and master's degree from what was Cincinnati Bible College and Seminary, and a PhD from the University of Sheffield. Prior to coming to Pittsburgh, he taught New Testament at Johnson University in Knoxville, Tennessee for 18 years. His research is focused on 2 broad areas: the Gospels, social memory, oral tradition and performance, and the historical Jesus on one hand, and Paul as the Jewish apostle to non-Jews on the other. His most recent book, The First Christian Letters, Reading 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, bridges the gap between these oldest Christian texts and the challenges facing the practice of Christian faith today. He is currently writing a commentary on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and whatever you can find that he's written, you should get for the reasons I've already discussed. And yeah, I hope you really enjoy this conversation half as much as I did. All right. Well, Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, welcome to Unwriting the Bible. And since this is the first podcast that anybody will be listening to where I'm interviewing a scholar of oral tradition or media studies, I wanted to just go over like the goal of the podcast, like what we're doing here. And so I typed it out so I wouldn't screw it up. So the goal of the podcast is to bring more.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Did you say that you wrote it down so that you could explain this Unwriting the Bible podcast?
Yeah, 100%.
Got it.
Also, and don't forget the background of all my books as we're talking about the importance of not focusing on just textuality.
You may continue.
Yeah. Well, and also how both of us have written a book on the importance of the oral traditional approach for media studies.
That will come up later in our conversation. I know it will.
Yeah. It was actually John Goldingay was I just reached out to the biggest scholars I could think of. I wrote a email to NT Wright to write a blurb for the book, and everybody was sweet. And Tom wrote back, and said, sorry, I can't do it. On Golden Gate, his blurb was something like, and I think the publisher even like cut some of this off, but it was like, so I think you'll do well to get this book in which you'll learn a lot about oral studies. But the way he wrote it, he was clearly making kind of a little joke about, read all of this text about why everything's not about text.
Right.
Yeah,
Love it.
100%.
Love it. Sorry for
Yeah, so I wrote this
interrupting.
down. So now this is my memory aid for performance. Okay. So the goal of the podcast is to bring more awareness to the church of the oral traditional origins of the Bible and to discuss the implications of those origins on biblical interpretation, proclamation, and application. And as you'll see as we go through this conversation and other conversations, there's lots of vocabulary that we'll have to talk about and figure out what's the best way to say it or whatever. But the idea is to find out, the Bible is was a part of something greater than what it represented, or it represents something. Yeah, and so to come to it for what it was, what it is, and see what that means to us for our interpretation, proclamation, and application as the new bearers of that tradition, so that we can enjoy the Bible even more for what it is. And so here's something I say to my students now. I say, the Bible is not just a text to be studied, but it is part, I should say it's a performance of a tradition of identity that's to be reproclaimed and reenacted and lived out in the community of faith. And so that's why I named the podcast Unwriting the Bible, as clunky as the name is, because my goal is to move to the text, seeing it as a representative of a greater unwritten tradition, so that we can re-engage that more full tradition as much as possible and let that tradition establish itself as our identity in our flesh and blood lives. And so that's my goal, and that's what I mean by unwriting the Bible is bringing that back, seeing it as something that was unwritten as much as it was written, and then bringing it into our unwritten lives. And so Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, since you literally wrote the book on what we're talking about doing, or at least a book on what we're talking
the
about.
book. You had it. You had it right. The book.
So could you just, I would love to hear anything that you want to share with us about yourself, including your journey on discovering this dialogue on orality, oral tradition, media studies, and all that.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for inviting me, for having me. It's just it's a joy to meet you and to have this conversation. My journey into media studies, oral performance, and whatnot. I was doing the research for my first book, and I was really interested in how this theory of social memory theory. So another way of putting it would be the sociology of memory. How do groups remember the past, reconstruct the past? How does our location within specific groups affect the past that we remember? I was researching in this area, and there wasn't a lot at the time that brought memory studies into biblical studies, but memory studies was massive everywhere else in the humanities, in history, in sociology, and anthropology, political science, literature, Holocaust studies. It's just big in a lot of places. So there was a lot of material, and I'm learning a lot. And it's, you've had this experience where it's just exciting to be learning new things.
Right.
But kind of on the edge of what I was learning about memory and all of these different fields. There would be references to what I later discovered were two different things, but I thought were one thing, and that's oral tradition and oral history. Oral tradition, oral history. And so pretty quickly, I thought, I'm going to have to, if I'm going to move into, bringing memory studies into biblical studies, I'm going to need to get some facility, some awareness, some familiarity with these concepts of oral tradition and oral history. So I did that. I spent about 6 months, well, maybe a little less than that. I spent about 4 or 5 months reading books and articles and learning everything I could, came to realize that oral history is actually a process of learning about past events from the people who experience them. So it's much more concerned
Mm-hmm.
with issues of interviewing and what kinds of questions to ask, how to reduce the influence of the interviewer on the interviewee, how to
Mm-hmm.
interrogate um, um, uh, oral sources for information without re-traumatizing them if it's a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
What oral
Mm-hmm.
history is one thing, and oral tradition is another thing, which often has to do with stories that go back much further in time. Here we're talking about events that maybe I didn't experience myself, but the stories that make us, that tell us who we are, and how these
Mm-hmm.
stories are passed down across time. And so these two different fields, and I learned kind of a lot. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I know a lot about these fields. And in that research, a name that I kept running into was a guy named John Miles Foley. And so,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of, okay, well, at some point, I'm going to have to find
Right.
John Miles Foley, and I'm going to have to
Right.
read this. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and so, 4 or 5 months in, I've done a lot of the reading that I wanted to do, and I picked up John Miles Foley's *The Singer of Tales and Performance*. And go, okay, this book's about 10 years
Mm.
old now, so it's not brand
Right,
new, but
right.
it's still pretty new,
Yeah, yeah.
and I'm going to learn a lot. I start reading it, and I just fell flat on my face. I
Yeah,
had
yeah.
no idea what he was talking about. I
Mm.
could not follow his train of thought. I could not follow
Mm.
the concepts, the ideas. I was clueless.
Mm.
And that was shocking to me because I had just spent 4 or 5 months reading in these fields. I should know what's going on here. And so it
Mm-hmm.
literally took me a month. In May of 2004, I was
Mm.
spent reading this one book, not even a very thick book, but just trying to
Mm.
to understand it.
Yeah, yeah.
And what that book did to me was it changed the way I think about language and tradition, and
Mm-hmm.
that the social experience of being in relation to other people, to people that you look up to as mentors, as authority figures, people that you look at as peers, and even people that you look on as, and I don't mean this negatively, you look on as obligations, passing on to the next generation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that these that
Mm-hmm.
these relationships um, um, often provide the context for the kinds of stories that we tell and how we tell them. So as I'm hearing important formative stories from, I don't want to be stereotypical here, but from my wise grandmother or from my father, as
Mm-hmm.
I'm passing these on to my children, the
Mm-hmm.
story
Mm-hmm.
matters absolutely, and the text of that story, the content of that story matters. But so does the relationship that is involved in telling the story and that motivates the
Mm.
story. And so does the fact that you don't do this once. It's not like one day you're sitting there eating your oatmeal and your grandmother says, "Okay, right, I'm going to tell you a story. This is important.
Right,
I'm never going to tell it
right,
to you
right,
again." No, these are the things that we
right.
do all the time. In fact, that's what tradition means, is the iterative handing on of something. So
Mm.
so it's not a
Mm.
new thing, but it's something that you've experienced before. You're aware of experiencing it now, and you know you will experience again in the future. And
Mm.
John Miles Foley's emphasis on the experience of that performative event and
Mm-hmm.
the connection between those other events and the text at hand really just changed the way I read. At the time, I was focused on
Mm.
the Gospels. So really just the way I located the Gospels within a broader, we'd say community of faith now, but as people gathered to
Mm.
tell the stories about Jesus, um, to worship, to teach, to instruct, to comfort, to encourage, but also to
Mm.
defend, to argue, um, that these contexts and these events were important parts of broader, a term I use, but because I got it from another scholar, but it's kind of a corny term, kind of the broader biosphere, the
Yeah.
ecosystem or the environment that the text is in there, but its
Mm.
location in there affects what the text means. And if we took it out and put it somewhere else, like in a book and just handed it to somebody and said, "Here, read this," the experience is going
Hmm.
to be very different. So, does that make sense as kind of how I got into thinking about?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it sounds so what I hear you saying is that when you got into Foley, it sounds like what you realize is the power of having a tradition standing behind you,
Mhm.
especially from like a person of influence, but and the the biosphere, or it's kind of like the you could say the atmosphere, the environment created by those meaningful voices in our lives, that they're always just hovering around us
Mhm.
and reminding us what is real, and what is not, what is good, what is not. And that those voices, it didn't just happen one
Mhm.
time with grandma sitting down and saying, "Hey, I want you to remember this." But there were stories told, different stories that had the same point. I mean, it was just this entire universe of culturalization that we all go through. And that what Foley, it sounds like what Foley said is, what you get from Foley is, oh man, like I can't take the New Testament, the early church tradition, outside of all that they wrote within their own environment there.
Mhm.
And it just is that the shift?
Yeah,
Was
yeah, I
is that
think
the
that's
shift?
right. And I think, if I can, as an example, if I was, let's say, if I was an Australian, and I
Mm,
used the phrase freedom and justice,
mm,
those are words that have meaning and are probably connected to things. I'm not an Australian, so I don't know what they're connected to
right, 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 right.
or whatnot. But they're usable, and whatnot. But I'm not Australian, I'm American. And when I say the words freedom and justice, I have to actually make myself stop because I know that the next words are for all and freedom with freedom and justice for
Mm.
all. Like because of that
Uh,
repetitive, I mean, we were indoctrinated
sure,
as kids to say a
sure,
thing
sure.
that ends with freedom and justice for all. And
Right.
and even if you stop there, even if this is actually so, to kind of come to an example here. Um, if you stop the phrase with freedom and justice and you don't say for all, somebody
Mm,
who lives in that same ecosystem that you and I live in, this
mm-hmm.
can bring in the for all. The text doesn't have to do the work because
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah, yeah,
already
yeah.
know it's there. And I think that has some really significant consequences for how we interpret certain scenes from the New Testament. For example,
For
I
sure.
hadn't thought about this or in a long time and planned on talking about it, but in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus stands up for the first time to
Oh
give
no.
his inaugural teaching, he's in the synagogue in Nazareth. And a scroll is handed to him, and he finds the place in the scroll of Isaiah where it's written. And then this passage is, Luke actually gives the contents that Jesus is looking at. Um, and the quotation there in Luke 4:16 to 18 um, ends at, he sent me, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has sent me to proclaim comfort for the captives. And again, doing this from memory, it's going to be wrong, but
Right, right. Yeah.
comfort for the afflicted and recovery of sight for the blind and release for the prisoners. And then and the year of the Lord's favor. And then it stops.
Mm,
And if you look at Luke commentaries, um, the vast majority of them, I mean, easily two-thirds, three-fourths of them, are going to make a big deal of the fact that the text stops in Luke, or
mm,
sorry, in Isaiah, the quotation of Isaiah 61 stops before the phrase and the recompense of the Lord.
right, right,
And
right.
so look at how Jesus
Hmm.
Jesus is proclaiming the Lord's favor and blessing, and he's not proclaiming the Lord's wrath. And
Mm,
and And what I learned from Foley was, well,
Hmm.
anybody who knows Isaiah 61 knows that that's next.
Right, 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 right,
Now,
right, right,
Jesus
right,
could say, hey, guys, and I know that the next part of the text says, and God's mad and he's going to pour that out on. Jesus absolutely could do
right.
that, but he didn't do that. He just left it. Um, he just left it unstated. Now you got to look at other parts of the text to say, what do we think
Mm,
was Jesus' view on the wrath of God? Does Jesus think that God's divine justice is going to come and repay those who are oppressing his children, who are oppressing the poor,
mhm.
who are oppressing the weak? Do the disciples themselves find themselves under threat of judgment? And the answer is, of course, of course they do. And so this
Mm.
way of reading that focuses very narrowly on the text
Yeah,
and misses the connections to these broader echoic resonances, I just think
right.
is very, very, very scholarly, very academic, but not really what the people of God have heard throughout the ages.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I forget where I stole this from. Maybe I stole it from you. I don't remember who I stole it from. I modified it some, but someone talked about it. If you could take, and I think they used a different time frame, but I did some calculations. But anyway, whatever. If you take the time frame from, let's say, writing was started sometime around 3000 BCE, and so we're here now at 2025, right? If you take that 5,025 years and you just cram it into a 24-hour period, then the printing
Oh,
press
yeah.
would only have been in operation the last 2.5 hours of those 24
Yeah.
hours. And so the vast majority of, and then not to mention the majority world, where how much are books and texts available to the average person, even in since the Gutenberg printing press. And I know there was a printing press in China before Gutenberg, but whatever. Like, um, uh, how many, the vast majority of all of humanity haven't read their definitive stories, but have heard
Right.
them.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I the a lot of the early scholars who were talking about this kind of difference of this kind of culture, this kind of tradition, they called it oral tradition because a lot of golly, it's hard to know where to start because there's to explain a whole field. But I think what's safe to say, whether you're Ong or Foley,
Mhm.
is that these cultures that we've studied, both living traditions, living cultures, and cultures of the past that even have some residues of their tradition in writing, that they communicate more or less in some ways that we can generalize. Every oral tradition is different, but there are some things that we can generalize that's different than the text saturated. And this is something I've been really thinking about. It may not even be just like, oh, you've been able to read and write or not, but it may be as much of a post Renaissance, Enlightenment, rationalistic, industrial, scientific revolution, Western culture that is text saturated.
Yeah.
That these cultures aren't that.
Yeah.
It's not so much the writing itself as much as some of those cultural influences. But at any rate, that these cultures that when things are not written to be mass produced from a printing press,
Mhm.
to be studied alone in offices, what we actually have is um, tribal identifying stories of a community that is performed by official tradition bearers
Mhm.
to the community who already know the stories.
Mhm.
That this is an entire type of communication that's different than the text saturated Western culture that's been producing most of the studies of the Bible over the past 200 or 300 years.
Mhm.
And so yeah, can you walk us through a little bit, like how you've been when you started engaging this, and you say in your book, Oral Tradition in the New Testament, a guide for the perplexed, that you talk about um, how as the field's grown, we don't just want to look at these things as oral traditions. It's not just, oh, we're talking about orality as opposed to textuality. Like, and you're also saying that the culture of the tradition of the Bible is different than what we've been expecting it,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So can you walk us through just some of those, the tension of those things?
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I'm not even convinced that it's as different from our world as we want to describe it.
Hmm.
But it is very different from the idealistic Bible as text that we have. Here's kind of what I
Yeah, yeah.
what I mean by that. You actually would know more about this. When the biblical texts were discovered in caves, um,
Hmm.
in the Judean desert, just northwest of the Dead Sea, back in the
Hmm.
20th century.
Hmm.
One of the things that very quickly happened was one of the first one of first set of among the first sets of texts that were published was the Great Isaiah Scroll, and one of the
Hmm.
things you saw from people who had a really high who had a who have a high view of Scripture and of inspiration and of the importance of the words of these texts. One of the things that you heard
Right, right, right.
from these voices was that, look, here is a text of Isaiah that is over 1,000 years older than our
Right,
next oldest version of Isaiah, and look at
right.
how much these two texts align. And so we can have a lot of
Yeah,
confidence in the transmission, not just of Isaiah, but of the words of Isaiah, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you still, you can still hear that point made today. The irony is,
Hmm.
though, that, and as you know, anyone who looks at all of the textual forms of
Hmm.
Scripture preserved at Qumran knows that
Hmm.
perhaps the most interesting thing about Qumran and the Bible at Qumran is that there isn't a textual form.
Yeah.
It's not like here's a community that thought this is what Isaiah says and other versions of Isaiah are illegitimate.
Hmm.
What you have is you have a community that can have a text that looks more Samaritan than Masoretic.
Uh-huh.
You can
Yeah.
we have Hebrew and Aramaic texts that look more Septuagintal,
Hmm.
that seem to mirror, what prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls we thought were Greek deformations or transformations of the Hebrew text. Here's a
Hmm.
not just translation, but an interpretation that changes the text as it moves from Hebrew to Greek. Well, now we've discovered these texts that actually look like, well, maybe there was a Hebrew base for some of the things we see in the Greek text.
Hmm.
And so you see these different textual forms. Now that's interesting.
Hmm.
But what's more interesting to me, and I don't hear as many people talking about this, but what's more interesting to me is that you seem to have one community, and that may be a matter of debate, but one or at least one site that's gathering all of these texts, and that, as far as we can tell, doesn't have a problem with these variations in the texts, doesn't
Right, right.
mind that its version of Genesis, that it's this manuscript of Genesis looks like the Masoretic text, and this manuscript
Hmm.
of Genesis may look more Samaritan. And then
Hmm.
here's a text that's not even Genesis, but tells the same stories. Shoot, my brain is losing it. Is the Apgen, the Apocryphon of Genesis. That's not right.
Mm.
Yeah,
One
there
Q
you go. Not the
20. Is
Apocryphon
it
of
one Q 20?
Genesis. That's why that felt so weird. All right. So
Yeah, yeah.
so coming back to this and seeing.
Sounds like a gnarly text, by the way. I'm gonna look at that later.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very fragmentary, and it stops. It
Uh,
stops in exactly where I want it to get full in Genesis 15.
yeah,
But the Genesis Apocryphon is a
yeah.
retelling of the Genesis story, and Jubilees. Of course, you've got Jubilees. That's a retelling of from Genesis 1 to Exodus 19. So you've got
Right,
you've got all these texts that we as scholars know are different because we can compare them, and because we're nerdy enough that we do compare them, and we see their
right, right, right,
differences.
right.
But for all that we can tell, this community seems to think, oh, this is just the Abraham story, or this is just the Noah
Right.
story, and and so there was this comfort with textual plurality that
Mm-hmm.
that many of us are very uncomfortable with, right? That
Mm-hmm.
some of the
Mm-hmm.
debates that you find in the church today between People who think the King James Bible is the one
Right.
appropriate Bible for the church, or people
Right.
who prefer more modern translations, but in effect still are single translation churches. We all read the NIV, we
Mm.
all read the ESV because that's what we're comfortable
Right.
with.
Right. Right.
That's not
Right.
what we see at Qumran. You may hear
Right.
very different texts. I just think that's interesting. And then, I think it's also important to come back to today and say, as interesting as that is, that's actually not worlds apart different from the communicative environment that we live in. So,
Mm.
something that you could do, something that a lot of pastors have done is you can tell the Christmas story. I would
Hmm.
wait maybe. The middle of January is maybe not the best time to
Yeah.
do it, but wait till,
July's much
yeah,
better. Yeah. Christmas in July. Yeah.
exactly.
We're a Hallmark family here. So,
Tell the
yeah.
Christmas story. Talk about the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary. Talk about Mary's quiet reflection and acceptance of the things that are going to happen to her. Talk about the journey from Nazareth, from Nazareth down to Judea and to Bethlehem. Talk about the Magi's approach to the city and their arrival in Jerusalem and Herod's consternation. Talk about the shepherds and the star and all of these things. Tell the story. And then ask, hand some pencil and paper out to the people and say, okay, now I want you to tease apart which parts of this story come from Matthew,
Right. Right. Right.
parts of the
Right. Right.
story come from Luke, and which parts of the story don't come from any place, right? The
Hmm.
innkeeper,
Right.
I think, if I remember correctly, the
Hmm. Yeah.
innkeeper
Yeah. Yeah.
isn't mentioned by, it would be Luke, because there is an inn at least in Luke.
Uh,
Um, And yet nobody has a problem with this. Nobody goes, "Oh, excuse me, Pastor Nick, there's no innkeeper here in my text. How dare you mention an
right.
innkeeper and falsify the word of God?" Because it's part of that broader ecosystem of this is the Christmas story. And
Hmm.
and it's from an academic or from a historian's point of view, it can be very hard to bring Matthew and Luke together. Um,
Hmm.
in Luke, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. He goes to the temple on his eighth day to be circumcised. That's where we run into Simeon and Anna. And then, as far as
Hmm.
we can tell, they head back up to Nazareth. And there doesn't seem to be time for these magi to show up to offer their gifts, the
Hmm.
more dreams, warnings, and then Jesus and the parents flee down to Egypt while hell, almost literal hell, is being
Hmm.
unleashed on the families of Bethlehem. There doesn't seem to be time in the Lucan story to insert this Matthean story, and so from a historical point of view, it's very difficult to bring these stories together
Right.
as one. But from a traditional point of view, it's as easy as anything. Look at any nativity set. You're going to find shepherds.
Hmm.
You're going to find magi. We just do it. It's not
Right.
hard, and it's not
Right.
Bible stuff that we do this either. So I'll shut up here and let you come back into the story. But one of my favorite examples of this phenomenon is the classic song from the Eagles, Hotel California, right?
Hmm.
Probably anybody listening here can already hear the kind of stringy, kind of tinny electric guitar, the riff that opens it. It's very distinctive. It comes on the radio, you
Yeah.
know it right away. I think that song
Yeah.
from 1976,
Yeah. I think it's a 12-string guitar that gives it that sound. The 12-string
Is
guitar.
it an acoustic and not an electric in the original Hotel California? I don't mind you looking it up, but anyway, for for about 15 years or so, Hotel California had a pretty canonical sound. Now you might hear it live or something like that, it'd
Mm.
be different, but this is what the song sounds like. And I'm not going to hum it or anything, but as soon as you hear that riff, I'm listening to Hotel California.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then in
Yeah.
the early 90s,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the Eagles go on tour for the first time
Huh.
in 14 years or something like that.
Hmm.
And it's released as in the album Hell Freezes Over.
Uh-huh.
And you listen to Hotel California, and it starts off with an acoustic riff, with you
Hmm.
can hear the djembe, you can hear the egg shaker, the acoustic guitar, and it's nothing like Hotel California. It's really good, and you're listening to it. And
Uh-huh.
I timed it. You're listening to it for about 90 seconds before you get to that distinctive riff that tells you this is Hotel California.
Hmm.
And once you get to that, the audience erupts and they literally applaud
Right.
for 30 straight seconds. They're clapping, they're cheering, they're whistling while that riff is going
Hmm.
on. And you realize I've been listening to a song that I've known for over a decade. I've been listening to that song for 2 minutes and didn't know it, and I
Yeah.
love it, right? And
Yeah.
some people don't. Some people are like, no, the original version only. Other people, they only like the acoustic version. Me, I'm like, I love that these are the same songs, and yet I could, as
Right.
a nerdy musicologist, sit down and chronicle all the differences
Right. Right. Right.
and
Right.
all
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
But from a fan's point of view, it doesn't matter. It's the
Right.
song. This is what
Yeah.
it is. And I
Yeah.
feel like the Gospels are kind of like that too. That
Hmm.
that a bespectacled office-bound academic might compare, the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 from the Beatitudes and woes in Luke chapter 6 and
Hmm.
go, how do these compare? What do they have in common? What do they have differences? What changes do these texts make? But I think that somebody who just wants to hear the voice of Jesus, which is, most people who are reading these texts, aren't
Right.
at all troubled by, wait a minute, did Jesus say, blessed are the poor in spirit, or did he bless the poor, the actual poor? It,
Right.
it is the tradition of the Beatitudes.
Yeah. 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 It's these traditions, like we with our immovable type, we want to know, tell me what happened. Like, did that happen or not? Did he say it or not? And I
Yeah.
understand, because there is a level of that matters,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Paul would say, if Jesus wasn't resurrected, then we're cursed above everyone. Like, something
Absolutely.
had to actually happen. But oral traditional cultures, traditional cultures, or whatever term we end up landing on, they're telling the story to say, this is who we are.
Hmm.
And who we are is based on stuff that actually
Yeah,
happened.
yeah, yeah.
But when we perform these traditions, I'm not trying to tell you exactly how many chariots were in the battle. I'm not trying to tell you the exact chronology of what happened.
That's right.
I'm trying to tell you, hey, these things happened, and this is who we
That's
are.
right.
So let me reperform
Yep.
our identity in such a way that you can step into that identity in this moment.
Yep.
It's who you are, so be it
Yep.
together.
Yep.
And it's not less true. It's a different kind of truth. Two new favorite words when I started diving into this field were anachronism,
Hmm.
or anachronistic,
Hmm.
and ethnocentristic.
Uh-huh.
Is if we think the Bible has to tell truths exactly the way that our culture
Yeah.
wants those truths to be told,
Yeah.
we're being ethnocentristic, saying
Yeah.
you can only, truth only has value if it's
Yeah.
truth
Yeah.
according to my culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe an analogy here, because I just think analogies are the most helpful way for bringing some of this
Yes.
is,
Yeah.
I imagine that I could sing the Proclaimer's song to my wife. I would walk 500 miles and I would walk 500
Mm-hmm.
more to be the man who
Mm-hmm.
walked 1,000 miles to fall down at your door. I could sing that song to
Mm-hmm.
my wife.
Would you do that right now? Can we? Is that?
If she were in the room, I absolutely would, but she's not, sadly, so I can't.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Touche.
And she could go, really? You would walk 1,000 miles just to show me how much you love me. You would do that? Like, not 800
Right.
miles, not 900 miles, not
Right.
975 miles. You would walk 1,000 miles for me?
And not 1,001.
Fair. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
excessive here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
or she could take the truth of
Mm-hmm.
of those lyrics and say, my husband loves me a lot, and that's
Yeah. Yeah.
enough,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And
Right.
I feel like sometimes our analyses of the biblical texts can be a bit more like asking, did you actually walk 1,000 miles?
Yes.
And when maybe a more legitimate response to be would be, hold on, you said you would walk 1,000 miles for her, and now you're frustrated that you're watching a football game and she wants you to go switch
Right.
out the washing machine to the dryer. Like
Right.
that's the
Right. Right.
more appropriate critique is, hold on, you said this thing, and if it's true, we're not
Right.
going to get out our not speedometer. What would be the thing that measures the length of road you've traveled? We're not gonna measure how far you've walked, but we are going to
Mm,
judge your behavior. And I think that's similar to the gospel. So, we don't need to ask when Jesus got out of the boat
hmm
and was confronted by somebody possessed by demons. Was it one person or was it two?
Right. 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 Right.
This matters. The details matter. I'm not saying ignore it, but the reason they matter, the reason it matters
hmm
is differs. Does that make sense?
100%. One of the ways that I've said it is it's like the way we approach the Bible is we're going to argue over the shade of color of a section of the bark of a specific tree
Uh,
when we could enjoy walking through the
yeah,
forest
yeah, yeah.
together.
I like that. I like that. I think that's good.
Yeah.
I think that's
Well,
good.
it just
But I also want to
yeah.
just acknowledge that we are a print bound culture. Although we're
hmm
moving away from that, funnily enough, with
hmm
electronic texts.
hmm
Then we're not. We are a print bound culture, and that does make a difference. I don't want to I don't want to minimize that. But let's not miss the extent to which we are completely comfortable with fuzziness in our texts.
mm
Maybe my newspaper, if it quotes the governor of California in an interview about fires in LA, maybe my
hmm
newspaper needs to get his words exactly right. And that's that print boundedness kind of thing.
hmm
But we do this kind of thing all the time where we paraphrase um, or where we restate using different words, where we miss details in a text, maybe details that matter. There's an essay by Mark Allen Powell that's not necessarily about oral tradition or anything, but he talks about how cultural location affects how people hear the text. And he talks about how um, um, uh, ministry students in Russia, when they hear the story of the prodigal son, focus on the severe famine that came on the land that led to the prodigal son um, uh, feeding pigs and missing
hmm
his father's background. And the majority of American students that Powell has worked with don't even notice the famine at all. And I remember when I first read that, I
Yeah.
was like, what famine? There's no famine
Yeah. Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
text. And
Yeah.
I went
Yeah.
back and I
Yeah.
read it. And I was like, holy cow, there's a famine in the text. Like here it is. Not
Yeah.
only here it is, and I missed it, but for certain kinds of reading, the famine is actually the thing that makes the text work. So
mm,
we do this all the time. We're not as text bound as we like to think we are.
yeah.
You get drawn into court, the precise words you used or that you said somebody else used,
Sure.
these things are going to matter. You get involved in a theological debate about whether God created the world in a literal 7 days and what is a yom and is it
Sure.
24
Yeah.
hours?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
You're gonna get very textual very fast. But we have
Right.
whole swaths of our lives, even in a post-Gutenberg world, where we still do a lot of traditional things that look awfully traditional, like the multiple text forms at Qumran or
Yeah.
various presentations of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels or whatnot.
Well, I think I think that that's because we can't help but return to who we
Yeah,
are, and we're not linear texts.
yeah.
We don't live out linear text. My relationship with my wife. So here's a fun story. Here's by the way, I love you. You are amazing at drawing analogies. The way you started your book on First and Second Thessalonians on junk mail.
Uh-huh.
I was like, ah, that was so good. It was so
Thank
good.
you.
Um, so we're not linear texts.
Uh-huh.
People aren't. Beck and I one time we had a fight, and we actually surprisingly, pastor and pastor's wife we're not perfect. And so we had a really big fight earlier on in our marriage, and we still have some later today. But whatever. We had this fight. We went to Johnny Carino's, this
Yeah,
restaurant, and they have this amazing bread and dip
yeah.
to open up, right? And so we had the bread, and I had some potato soup there, and I was eating, and she was really mad at me, and I was mad at her, and she was saying some stuff, and I just kind of shut down, and so she threw her bread at me, and it like threw it like pretty hard, and it's kind of crunchy and hard bread. It hit me in the chest and bounced into my soup, and I picked up the bread and I dipped it and started eating. And she said, "Aren't you going to respond to that?" And I looked up at her and said, "I'm sorry, I don't know how to respond to crazy." And I'm not lying when I tell you, she started laughing, and it ended the fight.
Good.
Now, you know what I didn't do next time we fought? I didn't say, "Hey, I don't know how to respond to crazy."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Because our relationship isn't linear.
Right.
No,
Right.
that wasn't a law or rule that was written into our relationship. Here's how you end a fight with your wife.
Right.
Just call her crazy.
Right.
No. And so I think that the modernity, the rationalism, that we grew into, that was like, we have to, the scientific revolution, and God bless science. Here we are chatting, across the United States. It's super cool. But we are not defined by just the linear text.
That's right.
And so I think we have to break out of that in some ways. As much as logic is true and real and works, it's not the full story. I can know things logically and be incapable of experiencing it emotionally and spiritually.
Yeah.
Because I'm more than just my linear brain.
Yeah. And I think what a lot of the scholars in this area have taught us that we need to learn, because they're right, is that technology, whether it's writing, which is a technology, or printing, the printing press, movable type is a technology, or then the advent of electronic media is a technology. Technology absolutely affects what we can do with language and how we can use language. Even to facilitate a conversation across a continent. Technology absolutely has consequences for how we can use language. But technology does not determine what actual human beings want to do with language. And I think that's where some of that consistency across, from an ancient traditional society, like the societies that develop the text that we call the Bible now, some of the consistencies from those ancient societies to our society today, some of the things that link us, that make us the same, is we just want to do the same things with language. We want to communicate. We want to understand. We want to relate to one another. We want to fight. We want to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. We want to, there's some things that you can do with words. Sometimes you just have to throw the bread at the person across the table. But the technology doesn't tell us what to do with language. But once we decide, here's what we want to do, technology provides us means for doing that. And the printing press has helped us reproduce language, has made both the production and the dissemination of the written word so much less onerous, so much less expensive, so that I mean, you can. I'm surrounded by paper that that my wife would say costs too much money, but I never would have been able to afford to do this if we were just two average Joes in the first century. This would be so much more expensive, but we would still want to use language to convey the sacred stories, to pass on the revelations of who God is and what He expects from us, to comfort, to console, all of these things. And so, technology, the technology of communication matters, but it's not everything. And so, moving on to something that I know you're aware of, is that's been one of my frustrations with some of the obsession with orality,
Yeah.
orality is a different kind of language. Orality,
Right.
whereas written texts can be logical and sequential, oral texts are paratactic and they just combine things together.
Hmm.
Where written text can be impassioned and rational, oral texts are immediate and adversarial and all that.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think they can be, but so can written text. I mean,
Right.
you're going to tell me that in our print and electronic age, we don't use texts for agonizing, for conflictual, contested purposes?
Right.
Of course we do. So,
Right.
I'm not as persuaded that oral language looks different than written language, but I am convinced that the experience of oral language is different than me sitting here at my desk reading reading a written text by myself. And that
Hmm.
experience is the thing that I think we've got to start paying more attention to.
Yeah, and define what the because here's something that when I was diving into this stuff, none of my one of the reasons I want to do this podcast is none of my professors were aware of Foley
Mhm.
and Niditch and Rodriguez and like Paul Eddy, and how even talking with Daryl Bach, who is such a blessed
Yeah.
soul. Like he exchanged emails with me, and was, I mean, took time to read my book. I mean, he was just a wonderful, wonderful soul. But I'm not sure how much he's gone down the rabbit hole of Lord and Perry and Foley and even Person and Carr. I don't know. Maybe he has, but um, uh, I found this YouTube from a university here in California. I won't say who it is, but this they were holding this conference, and one of the professors there started talking about they were affirming the documentary hypothesis. They're like, no, this is still true. People are wanting to go away from it, but this is still true. Some people talking about this oral tradition, like we all know how orality works. We've all played the telephone game, and so like so you see, so it's like or what I'm trying to figure out even really how to communicate this, which, and maybe I should have tried to figure it out before I wrote the book that I wrote, but is yes, it's not orality, and this is the whole great divide thing. It's not orality versus textuality, but it's also is we are talking about something here specific.
Mhm.
We're talking about a certain way of communication, a certain way of giving and receiving knowledge, and what that knowledge even means. Like
Mhm.
it's not even giving knowledge, right? I'm not trying to teach you data. Like what I'm actually performing is stuff you already know. You've been hearing it since you were in the womb,
Mhm.
and the whole community can tell me that I'm getting it right or getting it wrong, even as I'm performing it in a way they've never heard before. They can say, yes, I've never heard it that way before, and that's true, or no, you're getting it wrong, right? And I can choose different words. So we're talking about something, but we're not talking about the telephone game where some random person says a new phrase that nobody's ever heard, and they tell it over and over, and it changes over time. So what Jesus actually taught the disciples when it gets to Paul is, just something totally different.
Right.
So like, can you help us understand, like, what if we're not talking
Yeah.
about orality
Yeah.
versus
Yeah. Yeah.
textuality, but we're also not talking about the telephone
Yeah.
game? Like, what are we
Yeah.
talking about?
And this is why I like to shift the emphasis away from the adjective oral and onto the noun
Mm-hmm.
tradition, which actually
Mm-hmm.
has warrant in it's where you mentioned Lord before his 1960 book, The Singer of Tales.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's actually where he ends with maybe the really
Mm-hmm.
significant entity here in this discussion isn't in the word oral, but in tradition, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an insight that Foley took and ran with, and I should say that, and that was the impetus for my book, Oral Tradition in the New Testament. Was, man, it took me a month to understand this to understand this book after 4 months of diving into the field. I want to
Right,
make this
right, right.
accessible to other people. But
Yeah, yeah.
but you're exactly right. I mean, I'm looking at a book over there on the shelf right now, written by a very smart guy, very popular author. If I told you who it was, you'd recognize his name right away. And he does exactly what you just said. He says, oral tradition is like the telephone game, and we know how language, how the signal, the thing that you say in the telephone game, that signal gets corrupted by noise, by
Hmm.
by uh, lack of clarity, by we're whispering, and I just want to shout from the rooftops. That's not what oral
Yes.
tradition is.
Yes,
Oral
yes.
tradition isn't
Yeah.
somebody whispering some arcane phrase that's meant to be misheard and corrupted to one
Right.
person, and then that person turning and repeating what they think they heard to the next person. And maybe some of those people are actually kind of impish and know that the game is most fun when distortion
Yeah,
is maximized.
right.
And so they're going to intentionally,
Yeah.
full disclosure, if that would be me, I'd be like,
I was about to say, I'm pretty sure that was you, wasn't it?
yes. Um,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
when we're talking about tradition, which is experienced orally, but also through
Mm.
other media, through ritual,
Yeah, yeah, right,
right?
right.
That
Right, 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 right.
the story of Jesus' final supper with his followers isn't just
Mm.
told in Mark chapter 14 and in Matthew and in Luke. It's not just told in those texts, it's also experienced in the gathering of the community.
Right.
And we know that from Paul, who I mean refers
Right, right,
to that meal and says,
right,
you guys aren't listening to the story, or if you are, you're not living that story out in the way that you behave. And there's another
right.
medium, is ethics, right? That the Jesus tradition isn't
Mm.
just the stories that we tell, it's also how do we make our decisions? How my wife just threw a piece of food at me and it fell into the dip in front of me. How am I going to respond to this? I could pick it up from the dip and throw it back at her. That would be fun. I could way
Mm.
overreact and become violent and aggressive. Now, that's not very
Mm.
Christian at all.
Right.
And so even our ethical choices are examples of the
Mm.
of the tradition being reflected us in our
Yeah, yeah.
art, in our music,
Sure.
in the songs that we sing, in moving from an ancient context to today, in our newspapers, in our textbooks,
Mm.
in our television shows, in our dramas, our plays, our theater. All of these are media, and
Mm.
that's what oral tradition is. It's one medium. Written texts are one medium.
Mm.
We've got a multitude of media that are surrounding us, enveloping us. That's why I like the language
Mm.
species as it is of a biosphere or an ecosystem. And
Mm.
that biosystem is reinforcing the message for us. So rather than one person whispering a message to another person, it's like being in a room filled with posters and speakers,
Right.
and everybody's telling you the same thing, and it's just reinforcing. And so when I walk out of that room, I might not,
Mm.
hey, what'd you learn about in Sunday school today? I might not use exactly the words that my Sunday school teacher used to teach me whatever lesson it is I learned. I might not use those
Mm.
exact words as I'm telling, here's what I learned in class today, but I'm going to get the message right. And
Right.
that's what that telephone game analogy misses and is designed to miss.
Yeah.
It's designed to
Right.
miss it. It's designed to tell you. And so all you can trust is the text. Listen, at the end of the day, 90% of what we're working with, maybe more than 90%, of what we're working with is the text. And so we can come
Oh,
back to,
sure. Right, right. Right.
that this is the unfortunate thing about studying the Bible in the
Mm.
21st century, is there's so much we don't have.
Right.
So, one thing that I frequently say is we don't have a single syllable of early Christian oral Jesus tradition. We don't have any of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But if we're interested in these texts, we have got to place ourselves in an imagined scenario where the author and the earliest readers or hearers of these texts would have been, where they're surrounded by these media that are reinforcing the messages of these texts. So
Yeah, 100%. Like to another to draw to build on the example that you gave of like the Lord's Supper, right? As how and I don't remember if all the Gospels do or which Gospels do. I think John does, but connects that Last Supper to the Passover meal,
John
right?
does not.
So
Yeah,
John doesn't. It's the other ones.
yeah. John does not, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke do, and that's
So
a very interesting.
so then you've got all the tradition that you painted, like when they're sitting around, they're breaking bread and committing them, they're daily breaking bread together, right? Like just saying they broke bread together, all of a sudden, in the early church tradition, oh, they were breaking bread together. Well, the people on the road to Emmaus
Mhm.
knew Jesus in the breaking of the
That's right.
bread because Jesus broke the bread at the Last Supper. So when we're breaking bread daily, like they're doing a ritual
Hmm.
to demonstrate that they are partaking
Yeah,
of the body and blood of Jesus.
yeah,
And then, but even that, what Jesus was doing on the first place is saying, "Hey, I'm the Passover lamb.
yeah,
Like my blood is the new covenant."
yeah,
Like, and so then the new covenant, boom, they just shot all the way
yeah,
down
yeah,
into their Jewish
yeah,
traditions. I mean, their tribal origin identity all the way down to the covenant that's sealed in blood of Moses sprinkling blood on the people,
yeah,
of blood being poured out on the altar. I mean, it's uh, it activates
yeah,
the entire that whole
yeah.
biosphere, and that biosphere, it's yeah.
It tells you what these events mean, and you bring up a really interesting example because Matthew, Mark, Luke, all three gospels, that final meal is a celebration of the Passover.
Hmm.
Intentional. It's where we're going to celebrate the Passover. Jesus sends two of his disciples. You're going to see a man carrying a jug of water. Follow him. Walk into his house. And I mean, this would be rude if it happened today. Just walking into somebody's house and going, "Hey, where's the place where the master can celebrate the Passover?"
Yeah, right,
But
right.
dude seems to be okay with it, so he shows them, and they have the Passover, and then Jesus is arrested later later that night, crucified the
Hmm.
next morning.
Hmm.
In John's gospel, you've still got a meal, and in chapter 13, you get, and after the meal, knowing that the hour had come, and so that all things would be fulfilled, he stands up and he wraps the towel around his waist, and he takes a basin of water and kneels and he begins to wash
Mm,
the disciples' feet. And
mm.
maybe if you're like us and you're familiar with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you might say, "Oh, after the meal, that must have been the Passover meal." But you can't do that with John because, in actual fact, what happens is John has Jesus crucified
Right,
and dying while the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. And
right, right, right.
I don't slaughter my own food, but I'm pretty certain that slaughtering the food happens before you cook and eat the food. I don't think it happens
Mhm,
later. So
mhm,
Jesus is in John is killed before the Passover. And that's a huge issue. And so historians are going to argue it has huge
right, right,
consequences
right,
for
right, right.
what day of the week is Jesus killed on? What day of the week does the I can't remember now if it's the 14th or the 15th of Nisan fall on? That's going to have huge
Mhm,
consequences for
mhm,
which year do we think Jesus
mhm,
was crucified? It's hugely important. And yet what we see is, well, John's doing something interesting with the tradition. Rather than
right,
having Jesus celebrate the Passover and then get arrested and crucified, John's going to link the crucified Jesus with the Passover lamb
right.
that's slaughtered and whose blood is smeared on the doorposts and the lintels so that the angel of death passes over the house of the Israelites and all that. And it gets even more. But wait, there's more, right?
Yeah.
That John has this weird discourse that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have in chapter 6, where after feeding the 5,000 with the bread in the wilderness,
Mm,
got this weird discourse where Jesus talks about how my flesh is true bread, and whoever would eat my
mm,
flesh and drink my blood has
mm,
eternal life. And that's Eucharistic language. It's almost like
mm,
John knows that Jesus has this meal where he hands his followers food and says, "This food is me. You're eating this food, you're
mm.
eating me, and this is life for you." But he's not going to narrate that when we get to the end of the story. And so, how does any of that work? From a textual basis, it
Yeah,
gets really difficult. But from a traditional
yeah.
basis, again, it's kind of like our our nativity sets where I've got no problem. Textually, I have a hard time getting magi and shepherds at the same place at the same time. But
Right.
emotionally, not hard at all.
Who
And
cares? Yeah.
and that's how we are, as we read the
Yeah.
text, it's not hard.
Well, and to John, in the book that I wrote, Exegeting Morality, I have a section on looking at John and how John starts Jesus's ministry
Mhm.
with the turning water into wine. In the very next scene, he's in the temple at Passover and says,
Right,
"Terror,"
right.
and that statement that you like to talk about too. But destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it again, or whatever.
Yep.
And he's talking about his body
Mhm.
on at Passover,
Yeah.
and then that John parallels that to Passover when they are destroying Jesus's body
Right. Right.
and
Right.
inadvertently
Right.
just
Right.
in the spiritual realm destroying the temple.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And again, I want to say, but there's more because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is
Uh,
that action in the temple. It is that action in the temple that leads to Jesus um, being arrested and tried. And we heard this man say he's going to destroy this temple made with hands, and after 3 days build
mhm,
another
mhm,
not made with hands. That is what
mhm,
leads to his death. You can't do that in John because that happens in chapter 2. You can't have Jesus die in
mhm.
chapter 2 or chapter 3.
Right.
He's not going to get arrested until chapter 18. So you've got this
Mhm,
long span. You
mhm,
literally what's happened is John has taken the events in the temple that are so very closely associated with Jesus' death, and he's pulled it back to the beginning of the narrative. And
mhm.
I'm imagining a spring where, when you pull a spring, you can and the further you pull it, the more tension you can feel.
Yeah.
And so when you read the story of Jesus in the temple in John chapter 2, do you see that tension anywhere? And the answer is yes, you do. Because in
Mm,
John chapter 2, you still see that the incident in the temple is linked with Jesus' death. That
yeah.
that well, they didn't realize he's not talking about these stones around here. He's talking about his
Right, right,
body.
right, right,
About
right.
kill his body.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
disciples, they didn't understand what Jesus was talking about either until he was raised from the dead. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
even here where John is kind of the live version of Hotel California. Like there's so many things
Mm,
that are just different.
right, right,
It's just
right.
it's like I didn't even realize we were telling the same stories. And then as it went on, oh wait, this is that. And
Yeah.
it's kind of cool for that. And it's hard for me to say that because John is not my favorite gospel.
Yeah.
But it is
Well, and
cool
this
the way
this
he
kind of
does that. I mean, he is really clever.
yeah,
Clever is the wrong word. He's
inspired.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
he's it's not just hey, those guys told you a lot of good things about Jesus, but there's also some important things that he's missed. It's not just that.
Mm,
It's here's a new way to tell the same story so that you'll get some of the same points, but you'll also see some different nuances.
yeah. And the creativity and this is again like this is a reflection of how the kind of culture, the tradition that we're talking about, like how it works is, I mean, because like Jesus's mom only shows up in the book of John twice,
Mhm. Mhm.
right there at the wedding at Cana
Mhm.
and at the
Yep.
cross, where the water turned to wine
Yep.
and the blood and the water spills out and
Yep.
Jesus drinks the different word for wine,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
the sour wine or whatever. But it's like he is intentionally bringing these echoes that's always
Yeah.
activating and echoing that circumambient
Yeah.
the biosphere
Yeah.
tradition,
Yeah.
and what's so important too about this traditional culture that we're talking about is this is not just grandmas and grandpas, moms and dads sitting around a family fire telling these stories. Like there are like official bearers of the tradition. This is the apostles,
Mhm.
and why the New Testament, the canonization process,
Mhm.
like the apostolic authority was so
Yeah.
important because they were the official carriers of the Jesus
Yeah.
tradition, the teachings of Jesus. And so yeah, as we're trying to describe the kind of culture that we're talking about that is very distinct from at least the modern. I know we're supposedly postmodern, maybe we're postmodern now. I don't know where we are anymore, but as opposed to the modern you know, give me the just the facts, ma'am,
Mhm.
kind of culture. Are there any other things that you could see that's worth teasing out of like what we're actually talking about, that the texts that we have
Yeah.
were a part of this kind of
Yeah,
culture?
yeah. Yeah, so here's one. I don't know if it's half baked. It's certainly underbaked, right? Let's leave the oven on a little bit longer. But here's an idea that
Mm,
I'm toying with. I'm thinking about writing it up, or writing up. I have for years I've been unsatisfied with the way Christians and commentators read Romans chapter 3. In Romans
mm,
3, you get Paul saying, we've already accused both Jews and Greeks of being under sin, just as it is written. And then in verses 10 to 18, you get a series um, of scriptural citations. We call it a catena or a catena, a chain of
okay.
references, just one after the other. And they are bleak. There's none who
Mm,
does righteous. No, not one.
right, right, right,
The
right, right,
poison
right.
of asps is in their lisp, and all their mouth is an open trap, and just constant negativity. And the way we typically read this, both confessionally and academically, is here's Paul making the point that there are no righteous human beings. I mean, the text literally
Mm,
says there are none righteous, no, not one.
mm,
What I find curious about these texts, though, is that all of them, maybe with one exception, there's one from Isaiah that I might have to wrestle with, but apart from the Isaiah one, all of them are about a faithful Israelite crying out to God against his enemies. And that when he
mm,
says there are none righteous, no, not one,
mm,
he's not crying out about Israel's lack of faithfulness. In fact, he is the one who's crying, who's the speaker of these words is righteous. So he's not saying there are no righteous humans. He's saying there are no righteous pagans over there, right?
mm, mm,
And when I step back and go, well, if Paul was wanting to make the claim that both Jews and Greeks are under sin, would it be hard to find scriptural condemnations of Israel for being a sinful, unfaithful people? No, those passages are
mm.
all over the place, right?
Right, right,
I
right.
mean, Judges is a cycle of these things, right?
Yes,
It
yes,
would be
yes.
hard to find. So why does
Hmm,
Paul
hmm,
pick solely or almost solely from texts that are critiquing pagans
hmm,
from being righteous?
hmm,
And I think that's an association, that's a resonance, that's a connection that maybe Paul's doing on purpose.
hmm,
That when Paul says we've already said that Jew and Greek are under sin, and then he cites these texts that he's Paul's big problem is that there are people who are trying to become trying to join the people of God. There are individuals who are trying to join the people of God by becoming
hmm,
by becoming Jews. And I think as Paul is
hmm,
reading his I don't want to be anachronistic here, and suggest that Paul's reading his Bible, but as he's recounting and deploying his sacred traditions to make a point
hmm,
here, he's pointing out, look, there aren't any righteous pagans. And so
hmm,
even if they start to look and act and seem like Jews,
hmm,
they are still unrighteous. And this is the conclusion he draws.
hmm,
No flesh is made righteous by doing works of the law. So it doesn't matter
hmm,
if you are a pagan, doing the works of the law does not do what you think it does. In fact, it
hmm,
kind of makes your problem worse. But when we sever those traditional connections between the texts that Paul cites
hmm,
and the broader context that they were in before he cited them, it becomes easy for us to provide this new context. Oh, look, this is
hmm,
universal
hmm,
depravity. This is
hmm,
original sin. We feel like Oprah Winfrey. You're a sinful
hmm.
pagan. You're a sinful pagan. We're all sinful pagans. That's just not the
Right,
point that the text Paul was citing made.
right, right.
So I'm not so certain that it's the point that Paul is citing in his own is in his.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so important. The phraseology, and this is the approach to engaging the Bible this way
Hmm.
that you champion and what you call the contextual
Hmm.
approach, which is the tradition that the text came from, sat in, represent that
And
and
is an
this is really
example
nothing.
of, is a statement of.
Yes, yeah, a performance of,
Hmm.
right? The text is a
That's
performance
right.
of and for and to this traditional
Yeah.
community, and and this is really, I mean, what's funny to me is this is nothing new. Like, we're interpreting the Bible is, let's interpret it in
Yeah.
context.
Yeah.
We do the historical context, we
Yeah.
do the linguistic context, we do all these contexts, and part of the context is the tradition, the traditional reference.
Hmm. Hmm.
What somebody, like, if I said to you, "Hey man, you're going through a really hard time. Hey man, remember the Lord is our shepherd."
Hmm. That
Like, I said a
works.
whole lot more than that phrase. I just told you, "Hey man, you're in the dark shadow.
Yep.
Like, his rod and staff is going to
Yep.
protect you." You probably thought about John. The sheep know my voice. I'm the
Yep.
good shepherd. I mean, I said a whole wall of stuff by
Yep.
those few words.
Yep.
And so when we come to what you're saying is we come to Romans 3, Paul's referencing these things, but what did that reference actually activate in the hearts and
Yeah.
minds of the people
Yeah.
hearing that when Phoebe read it?
Yep.
You
Yep.
know,
Yep. Nice.
it's
Nice. Yep.
so
Yeah, that's right.
yeah,
My favorite counterexample is, and maybe you've seen this. It's a really pretty flowery meme, blue sky with, appropriate amount of clouds and all this. And then in beautiful curvy font it says, if you bow down and worship me, I will give all these things to you. And then a scriptural reference. Matthew 4, whatever. Now, if you don't know the context, you think, oh, that's cute.
right,
If you will just but bow down and worship him, he will give us all
yeah,
things.
yeah,
But you're
mm,
laughing.
mm,
Let me put you on
mm.
the spot. You can always edit this out if it doesn't work out. But why are you
Yeah.
laughing, Nick?
Well, because that's what Satan said to
That's
Jesus.
exactly right. Showed him all the kingdoms of the earth. He says,
Yeah,
all of
right,
these have
right,
been given me. If you bow down and worship
yeah,
me, I will give them to you. So the
right,
context, man, I can't just use, hey, oh man, these words say what I want them to say. So I'm going to use
yeah,
them, and
that's
who cares
right.
about the context? That's it.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
And we've always done that.
Yeah.
We've always done that. And what I want to say, and I think what you're saying too, is another step in that is to realize how these traditional cultures actually worked.
Yep.
And so one example that I do is I'd be interested to know if you agree with this or not, because I know you've studied Romans and Paul a little bit, right? You've at least read it.
Sure, sure,
Um,
sure. In the writing of my book on Romans, I did also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right, right, yeah. And your other book on Paul, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, probably a little bit. So Romans 9 through 11,
Uh,
crazy passage, right? Like 30% of all of Paul's Old Testament citations are in those three little chapters, and it's interesting because I know that you, if I remember right, one of the things that you like to highlight about Romans, what you believe, is that Paul was writing to um, uh, more of a Gentile audience. Did I get that right?
yeah.
Because
The only quibble I would make is I would have dropped the more of a. He's
uh,
writing to a Gentile audience.
yeah,
There
yeah,
are
yeah,
Jews there, but he's writing to Gentiles. I tell my students,
yeah,
if you write a letter home, Dad may be there, but you can write a letter just to your mom,
yeah,
and
right,
you may even think she's going to show him this. That's fine, but a letter to mom is a letter to mom, and you're going to write different things than a letter than you would to both your parents. And I think so. Anyway, he's writing to Gentiles
yeah.
in Rome. Yeah.
And a lot of people like to say, including, and I think I actually say this in what I wrote, was that Emperor Claudius had kicked the Jews out
Mhm.
and then had died, and so the Jews then came back in, and that might have been some issues
Yeah.
that Paul was addressing. And if I remember right, you're saying, well, maybe not so much.
I don't
Is that?
I don't think that that's a problem. I think that that's likely.
Mm,
Claudius. I think we traditionally date the expulsion of the Jews from Rome the year 49. Claudius dies in, I want to say, 54, and Nero becomes emperor, and we date the writing of Romans to about 57 or 58. So you're a few years
that's okay.
out.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it would make sense that you see Jews coming in. So I've got no problem with that. Um,
All right. I think the distinction is I was coming under the impression, I always thought, well, Paul is doing almost kind of the opposite of what he was doing in Galatians,
Uh,
is you had Gentiles forcing themselves on
uh,
Jews. And if I remember right, you're saying, no, no, it's kind of still kind of the same
Yeah, that's not how I would
thing.
read those chapters either. That's
Yeah.
right. It's very common. In fact, I'm a minority position, so I want to state that. And if I'm in a minority, there's a good chance I'm wrong. But the common reading is that what in the absence of those Jewish leaders who'd been expelled from the city, the church
Uh-huh.
really took on a Gentile flavor, and now
Mm,
we're 5, 7, 8 years after the expulsion. Jews are starting to come back, and the church has this Gentile flavor, and these Jewish leaders or figures were turning into the church, and there's some conflict here because oh,
mm,
things have changed, and that might be hard. What I don't find persuasive about that is I've never seen anybody explain the mechanism for that conflict. That here you
mm,
have, clearly nobody debates this. Here you have Gentiles who are intrigued by, interested in, even devoted to Israel's Messiah. And
mm-hmm,
then the emperor, for reasons, expels a bunch of Jews,
mm-hmm,
and we're still interested in this Jewish Messiah. And then when the Jews come back, suddenly we're anti-Jewish. Like I don't
mm-hmm,
see that. I actually read all of Romans as Paul's Paul's wariness for Gentiles is an over exuberant philosemitism that you
mm,
may seek to slough off your Gentile identity and become Jews. And Paul's like, it just doesn't work out the way you think it's going to. Like I
mm,
said before,
mm,
doing works of Torah is actually going to make your problem worse, not better. And besides, Abraham's the father of a multitude of nations.
mm-hmm,
You know,
mm-hmm,
Genesis 17:5, passage that Paul quotes in Romans 4. And so for Paul, it was important that Abraham's children be from a multitude of nations.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
I feel like I should stop, but let me just say, so you bring up Romans 9:11. So if Paul's not telling Gentiles, stop looking down your nose at Jews, both those who believe in Jesus and those who don't, stop looking down your nose at
mm-hmm,
them. If he's not doing that, what is he doing? I think what he's doing is he's actually defending the honor of God here. That
mm,
that if God has opened up his adoption to include the nations. We see this in chapter
mm-hmm,
8. You've received a spirit of adoption by which we cry out, Abba, Father. If God has
mm-hmm,
if God has brought the nations in as his people and now nothing can separate them from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, then what do we do about these promises God made to his ex,
right, right,
right?
right, right,
If
right,
if
right,
God
right,
made these
right,
promises to Abraham and his descendants and now is walking out on them to embrace a new people,
mm-hmm,
is God faithful? And Paul's whole point
right,
is, God hasn't abandoned his promises to
right,
Israel. And I think this is actually the whole point of the chapter. It's expressed in chapter 9, verse 6. The word of God has not failed. And then he goes
mm,
on to explain how it hasn't failed. And the climax of
mm-hmm,
that is the olive tree metaphor in chapter 11,
mm,
which leads to Paul saying, and so all Israel will be saved. And so what we see is,
mm,
no, God has been faithful to his promises to Israel, and he's opened up the blessing that was always
mm,
expected to pass through Abraham to the nations. Right? I mean, this is the heart of the Abrahamic call. I will bless those who
right,
bless you, curse those who curse you, and in you all the nations will be blessed. Um, Paul's like, this is what we see happening. Um,
yeah. And it's not supersession. That's not supersessionism, maybe at least by some definitions, because being ingrafted
mhm.
is not superseding.
That's exactly right. Paul's olive tree metaphor is not God got really mad at that olive tree, so he set it on fire and started a new tree.
Right, right, right,
It's he pruned off branches, but he is also able to graft those branches back in.
right.
And he's taken, I mean, Paul says that explicitly.
Yeah,
And he's taken
100%.
branches from another tree and grafted them. He grafted them. So what we see is an
Yeah,
expansion, and you're right to bring up. You brought up a really big word, supersessionism. This idea that the
yeah.
church supersedes or
Right, right,
replaces
right.
Israel.
Yeah,
That's absolutely not what Paul's arguing there in
yeah.
in chapter 9. But like I said, I also don't think it's the problem he's addressing. I don't think that Paul
Right.
is worried. There seem to be some Gentile followers of Jesus who are looking down their nose at Jewish followers of Jesus.
Mm,
I don't see that.
yeah, I've always asked the question to myself, why so much um, mass? What was the density of
Hmm.
saturation
Hmm.
of Old Testament
Yeah,
citations there?
yeah.
But I guess, and what I used to think was, well, he did that so that the Gentiles would have to ask their Jewish brothers and sisters to explain it to them,
Mm.
which is there's so many assumptions there.
Hmm.
But now I think it's just because if Paul is going to defend the character of God and his relationship with Israel, he had better do it by referring to the tradition of
That's
Israel.
right. This is what
I mean,
God said, and it's
right?
fascinating. You get. I don't want to. I don't want. I feel like we could do this for 6 hours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But you get really clever, really perceptive readers who see Paul do something like he does it towards the end of chapter 9. Paul quotes the Hosea story, right? Hosea, this
Mm-hmm,
really
mm-hmm,
tragic prophet who has to marry a prostitute
mm-hmm,
who has
mm-hmm.
kids. He can't even be sure, it's not like a paternity test, so he can't be sure that they're his kids, and he's got to give
Right,
them
right,
these awful
right, right.
names, not my people, not beloved. Could you imagine having a daughter and every time you called her, you had to call her not beloved? Hey, not beloved, come here. It's time for dinner.
Yeah, yeah.
These tragic names. And of course, the whole point is that the names reflect God's anguish at
Yeah.
his people's unfaithfulness, just like Hosea's
Mm-hmm.
anguish at his wife's unfaithfulness. But then the
Mm-hmm.
promise of Hosea is that he will say to the one who is not beloved, "You are my beloved." He will say to the one who is not my people,
Mm-hmm.
"You are my people." Now you get these really
Mm-hmm.
clever readers who say, "How interesting. Hosea has this promise that Israel will find renewal, and it's expressed through the
Mm-hmm.
change of his children's names. But Paul
Mm-hmm.
takes that and he applies it to Gentiles. And it's exactly the
Mm-hmm.
opposite problem of what I mentioned before in chapter 3. Here you have a text that applies
Mm-hmm.
explicitly to Israel, and readers
Uh-huh.
like N.T. Wright are going to apply to Gentiles. And I'm like,
Right.
no, Paul is
Right.
saying this is always how
Right.
God was going to work to Israel. The people's faithfulness is
Right.
going to incur wrath. He says, if you abandon my covenants, if you go after foreign gods, I will curse you, I will drive you out of the land, you'll be exiled, you'll be scattered. But I will remember my promises, my anger will burn itself
Mm-hmm.
out. I will renew my love, and I will be
Mm-hmm.
faithful to these promises. And he's narrating that here in Romans chapter 9. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, so there's one I want to make a point, or piggyback on a point that you made about how when we read the text without thinking about these references, and sometimes we'll make the connections. Oh, he's quoting this here, but some of approaching the text as a performance tradition means you need to dive a little deeper
Mhm.
into that reference
Mhm.
than and like some people would say, hey, you're taking that reference too far. And I'm thinking, or maybe you're not taking it far enough because you don't realize how deep these activations there
Right.
can go, right? And so when Paul says, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this?
Mhm.
Like to reference God
Mhm.
as potter and clay.
Mhm.
So a lot of times I hear this passage interpreted as you can't, very simply as you can't resist his will.
Yep.
Like if he says this about you, it
That's
is. If
it.
he says you're saved, you're saved. If he says you're damned, you're damned. Like boom, it's predetermined kind of a deal.
Mhm.
Um, but then you look at the citation or the reference.
Mhm.
When God is a potter or a clay, the most clear reference in the Old Testament is Jeremiah
Absolutely.
18.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the citation there is God tells Jeremiah, God says, if I say to a nation, I'm going to destroy you and you repent,
Mhm.
I will relent.
Right.
But if I promise good to a nation and they don't obey me,
Mhm.
like I will change my mind
Yep.
with them.
Yep.
And so like Paul there is saying, he's not saying with that reference, you're incapable of resisting his will. What he's saying to his Jewish brothers is, you are resisting his
Mhm.
will.
Mm,
stop.
mm,
Like, stop resisting his will. You are being hard-hearted
right.
like Pharaoh was. Like,
Mhm.
stop.
Right. Right.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Would you agree with that interpretation, with that
I took a
reference?
few things. I think absolutely is talking about Israel. I don't think he's talking to Israel. So this is where my argument about the audience of
Ah,
Romans
right.
matters. But I think the point that he's making is exactly right, or the point that you're making is exactly right.
Mm,
That Paul is not saying. Listen, who are you to complain if God says, "Yeah, I made these problems to Abraham, but his descendants turned out to really suck. So I'm going to destroy them and move on to something else." He's not saying that, and he's certainly not saying this in some kind of um, um, individualistic way. Some people I've created to be blessed and destined for eternal life, and some people I've created to be damned and destined to eternal destruction. He's
right,
not saying that.
right.
He is saying God is sovereign, and in his sovereignty, actually, the problem from a human point of view in understanding how God works is not in God's dispensing of wrath. That makes perfect sense to me. Why do bad things happen? We live in a world where, as a human being, I make bad things happen all the time. Why did this man's wife throw bread at his chest? Did you hear what he said to her right before that? I know you didn't emphasize that part of the story, but
Fair
that was
point. No, fair point.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
fair point.
The the shocking thing about God's sovereignty is that he has compassion on those on whom he has
Hmm
compassion. He has
hmm
mercy on those on whom he has
hmm
mercy. Now that's also Romans 9. The passage Paul is citing there from Romans
hmm
9 is Exodus 33, which is in the
hmm
aftermath of the golden
Right,
calf incident, right? And so
right.
here is God in the midst of the height of his people's flagrant idolatry. They're still in the
Hmm
wilderness and they're worshiping a golden calf. And it's not
Right.
even the gods of Egypt, right? Aaron's when the calf comes out. I love how Aaron says it. I just threw this gold into the fire, and this.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Who
but Aaron
knew?
says, yeah, look at this. He doesn't say, look, it's Ra or it's Osiris or so. He says, here is
hmm
Yahweh who brought you out. So we're worshiping God, but we're worshiping
hmm
God in this idolatrous
Yeah.
form. And even here, where God is fuming, he's mad, he wants to kill them all. Moses has to talk him down. Um, and yet God declares in his sovereignty his enduring um,
Yeah.
compassion and mercy. And that's the text that Paul chooses to cite. And so, yeah, I mean, I work at a Presbyterian seminary, and these are wonderful people, and I'm learning that there's so much more complexity and richness and depth to Reformed theology. So I'm not painting with a broad brush. This isn't Reformed theology writ large, but there are some
hmm
Reformed theologians who will say exactly what you said. Romans 9 shows us
hmm
that God creates some people for life and some people for death.
hmm
And they miss that Romans 9 is also Paul saying, are you kidding me? There's no
Right.
arbitrariness with God, and that's the point.
Right.
Not arbitrary. It's that
hmm
Paul, God is pleading with people. God is pleading with people to repent, because if they
hmm
do,
hmm
He will have mercy and compassion on on,
Yeah.
on them.
Yeah. And my interpretation of an overall message from Romans 9 through 11 from Paul is God has always been about choosing some
Mhm.
as a testimony for salvation for all.
Yeah, that's right.
That's why God chose Isaac,
Mhm.
not Ishmael. That's why God chose Jacob, not Esau. And then that's why God was gracious to you, even though in Exodus 33 it talks about them being hard-hearted or stiff-necked
Mhm.
people. When the same word stiff-necked is the same word for hard-hearted for Pharaoh. So then he goes and talks about Pharaoh.
Yep.
Then he talks about the and Paul in one of the Timothys, if Paul wrote Timothy's, right?
All right.
But Paul in one of the Timothys says he talks about vessels for destruction and vessels for honor.
Mhm.
But if you clean the vessel, it can be used for honor. So this terminology of vessel for destruction or vessel for honor are reversible
Mhm.
depending on how you
Mhm.
engage. And I'm also not like Pelagian, or is that right?
Yeah,
It was Pelagian?
yeah,
Yeah. I'm also not like it's just I don't know. And again, this is where our modern culture gets us is we have to have everything nailed down into a
yeah,
system,
yep,
but relationships aren't systems,
yep,
and we're never going to have a system
yep.
big enough or sturdy enough to hold all of who God
Yeah.
is.
I think, Nick, your father,
Yeah, I got three.
I think, blessings to you. The trick is you can't allow yourselves to be outnumbered. So I told my wife, if we have a third kid, we either have to push one of the kids out of the nest or we have to bring in another parent, because you can't be off balance. So we decided to stop at two.
We just pick one to neglect it every
I
month.
think
We
that's
just
fair. I
alternate
think
them.
that's fair. But I think, what if some of our theology took God's fatherhood a little more literally? And I don't mean, and so he's
Mm,
masculine and has
sure,
the
sure, sure, sure.
the bodily characteristics that differentiate masculine from feminine and all that. But what
Right,
if,
right, right.
as a father, there are certain things you want your kids to do, right? Brush your
Mm-hmm,
teeth, make their bed, eat their vegetables,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
treat one another nicely. There's certain specific things that you want them to do. But at the
mm-hmm,
end of the day, even if they don't do the things you want them to do, or they do the things you don't want them to do, but out of a good motivation, aren't you still pleased with them? Like, if
yeah.
if your kid, if you come home from work and you throw your keys on the end table and you kick off your shoes and you sigh because it was a rough day, and you walk into the
Mm-hmm,
house and there is your toddler sitting, you're supposed to say crisscross applesauce. I grew up calling that Indian style, and
yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know,
yeah,
but
yeah,
sitting on the hallway
yeah.
floor,
Right.
creating a work of art for you on the hallway wall with his markers. And he looks up at you with a big smile and he says, "Look what I'm making for you, Daddy." Aren't you at once angry that, that he's ruining the wall, and
Yeah,
also
yeah, yeah.
touched that he's motivated by love to do something for you? And I wonder,
Right, 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 right,
what if
right,
God's a
right.
bit like this? What if God has told
Mm-hmm,
us what he wants from us?
mm-hmm,
Yes, absolutely. And yet the person who, out of out of um, out of a desire to express his or her love for God, chooses to act a certain way. If they
mm-hmm,
do some things, it's like, I'm not sure that that's smart. I might not do
mm-hmm,
that, but I know that you're doing that because, out of love. How should we evaluate that person? And I mean, here again, I think Paul, we've gone from oral tradition to Paul, which is perfectly fine. I love it. I think Paul also
mm-hmm,
gives us an answer for that too. He, in
mm-hmm.
Romans 13, he's like, listen, whether you're, the law is summed up in this one commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so
Mm-hmm.
whether the law says not to commit murder, not to commit adultery, not to defraud your brother, not to covet, whatever
Mm-hmm.
it says, it's all, if you love your neighbor, you have fulfilled Torah.
Yeah.
And I think it really tells me something about the fatherhood of God, which is he's
Mm-hmm.
not there with his clipboard going, okay, what's Nick done today?
Yeah.
If he's checked off the good stuff and hasn't checked off the bad stuff, I'm going to be happy with him. I think
Mm-hmm.
instead it's, if he's tried to embody the love we have for each other in the way he treats me and the people around him, I'm happy. He maybe did
Yeah.
some things that I don't like. Tomorrow we'll work on that. Tomorrow we'll
Yeah.
tomorrow we'll clean the hallway wall. But right now,
Right.
I'm going to join my kid on the hallway floor and go, "Tell me about this artwork."
Yeah. Well, and if Jesus was right when he said, "When you've seen me, you've seen the Father,"
Hmm.
like that's what you see in Jesus, right? Is he moved to Peter, this goober of a fisherman who is just always flying off the handle, piping. Peter is always piping up, right?
Yeah.
And getting it wrong, denying Jesus three times, and Jesus didn't show up and be like, "What the heck what was it those three times?
Yeah.
Like, what's your problem?"
Yeah.
He said, "Hey, man, do you love
Yeah.
me?" He invited him in back into that relationship, and the people who Jesus, only people Jesus really raised his voice to and got upset with were the people who were trying to thought they were getting everything right,
Yep.
and he says, "Look, you're diving into these
Yeah.
scriptures,
Yeah.
but you're missing me."
Yeah.
They
And
they
that and
they,
that
t-
could be
they
the
get tested.
disciples,
Yeah.
or it could be the scribes. But that's exactly right. It's the it's yeah.
Yeah. Oh, gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, yeah, yeah. but that is the testament that Jesus, who articulated the unseen God,
Hmm.
the Father,
Hmm.
that's what he did. He moved to those people who were imperfectly looking for life.
Yeah.
But he the people who were sons of hell and making people twice the sons of hell they
Yeah.
were the people who thought that the point was to get all the rules right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's good.
that's good. Man, Rafael, thank you so much. I could talk to you for another like 4 hours, but I do want to be respectful of your time. I know you've got a life over there, and it's anything that you'd like to point people to.
Um, yeah. So as I was looking through your guide, I do think we hit a lot of what you sent, and then so much more. And I loved it. I mean, it's nice to meet you.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
nice to I hope and I trust that we'll have occasion to interact again in the future. It would be a shame if this was just a one-time thing. And I'm not talking about the podcast.
Hmm.
I just mean personally.
Yeah,
But
100%.
as for your question, are there places where people can run into me? I'd like to highlight that I've lost it. That
I
First
lost it a
Christian
long time
Letters
ago.
book
Yes.
on First and Second Thessalonians. I I'm actually really proud of this book, and I'm trying to. All right, if these are
Mm-hmm.
the oldest Christian texts we have, which is
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of people think about Thessalonians, are they outdated or are they still useful for the practice and the challenges of living Christian faith today? And so just trying to explore that. It was a lot of fun to write, and wrote it for people in the church. I was just last week, earlier this week, released an episode of Alex Bernardo's The Protestant Libertarian podcast, where he interviewed me on my chapter Ancient Media, which covers some of the same
Mm-hmm.
ground.
Mm-hmm.
Think
Yeah.
about oral tradition and the place of text within oral tradition, and so people may find that interesting. I know you're out in California, but if any of your listeners are here in Pittsburgh, look me up, stop by, darken the door frame of my office. I'd love to chat, get a cup of coffee, or whatever. Um, you can find me on Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's website, pts.edu. Shoot me an email. I'd love to interact with anybody that is wrestling with these questions, and just trying their best to understand these texts that for 2 millennia we've said, in some ways, in the most important ways that matter, Jesus is the Word of God. But in some ways, these texts are also the Word of God, and we seek
Mm-hmm.
to hear in them the voice of God speaking to us. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Raphael.
yep. Thanks, Nick.
I'll
Appreciate
talk
you.
to you later.